So what is poverty? I mean, it sounds like a really simple question, right? But once you start to dig in, you realize the answer is, well, it's way more complicated and honestly, a lot more personal than you'd probably guess. Okay, let's get into it.
All right, take a look at this picture. At first glance, you might think, oh, cool, some kind of trendy modern micro-apartment setup. But they're actually converted shipping containers, and they're being used as emergency housing for families who are homeless. It's meant to be a temporary fix for a really desperate situation, but people living there say they get unbearably hot in the summer and are just unbelievably cramped.
Now, for someone like Jenny, a single mom living in one of these places, the definition of poverty is crystal clear. She says being poor isn't about not being able to afford wants, like the newest phone. No, for her, it's that constant, grinding struggle to afford the absolute basic needs. We're talking food, heat for the home, and clothes for her kids.
But here's what's so fascinating. Her 11-year-old son, Michael, he sees it totally differently. To him, poor means you're literally living on the streets. So since they have a roof over their heads and they can get by, he doesn't actually feel poor. He's looking at the exact same situation through a completely different lens.
So who's right? Are they poor? I mean, their story just perfectly highlights the huge challenge that sociologists grapple with. How we define poverty really just depends on where we choose to draw that line. And as we just saw, even two people in the exact same family can draw that line in two very, very different places.
Okay, so how do we draw that line officially? Let's break down the main ways sociologists try to actually define and measure something this complex. Generally, sociologists think about poverty in two main ways. First, you've got absolute poverty. This is the really severe stuff, lacking the absolute bare essentials you need to survive, like food, clean water, basic shelter. Thankfully, in most industrialized countries, this is pretty rare. What's way more common is what we call relative poverty. Now, this isn't about basic survival. It's about being poor compared to the society you live in. It means you can't afford the kind of standard of living that the majority of people around you just take for granted. And this image just illustrates that difference perfectly. On the left, you see a refugee camp. That's a struggle for absolute survival. Then on the right, you have those container homes we saw before. The people living there aren't starving, but they are completely cut off from the normal housing and lifestyle that the rest of society enjoys. That is the essence of relative poverty.
So, how do you actually put a number on that? Well, in the UK and across Europe, the main official measure is something called HBAI, which stands for Households Below Average Income. It's actually a pretty simple statistical line. Basically, they find the exact middle income in the country. That's the median. And if your household has an income that's less than 60% of that middle point, you're officially considered to be at risk of poverty.
But is income the whole story? I mean, is money the only thing that really matters here? Some sociologists would say no, not at all. They argue that just focusing on income kind of misses the point. They think we should be measuring poverty by looking at deprivation. What are the things that people are actually forced to live without? Things that our society generally agrees are essential.
Okay, check this out, because this is really interesting. This shows what counted as a deprivation way back in 1979 from a really famous study by a sociologist named Peter Townsend. And look at some of these. Not having a party for your kid's birthday? Or not having a refrigeration in your house? These are things we might not even think twice about today, but back then, they were seen as real signs that you were cut off from a normal life. It just goes to show you how much our ideas of what's essential can change over time.
All right, so we've established that defining poverty is super complex. But one thing is for sure, its burden is not shared equally. Not at all. The risk is way, way higher for certain groups in society. So let's take a look at who is most affected. Let's just start with this one number, 4.1 million. Just let that sink in. That's the number of children who are living in poverty in the UK in 2017-18. That works out to 30% of all children. It's a staggering figure, and it really shows you just how vulnerable kids are.
And the risk also varies really dramatically by ethnic group. If you look at this chart, you can see the rates of relative poverty after you factor in housing costs. So while 20% of the white majority population were in poverty, that figure jumps, it soars to 50% for people of Pakistani ethnicity, and then it goes up to a shocking 65% for people of Bangladeshi ethnicity.
Gender is another big factor. Women make up a clear majority of adults living in poverty, about 58%,
And a big reason for this is often linked to the fact that caring for children or for other relatives still tends to fall disproportionately on women. And that, of course, really impacts their ability to get and keep full-time, better-paying jobs.
Okay, now here's a fact that really challenges a common stereotype. Half of all people in poverty in the UK live in a family where at least one person has a job. This is the reality of what's called in-work poverty. And it tells us that for a lot of people, that old promise that a job is your guaranteed ticket out of poverty, well, it's just not true anymore.
So all of this leads us to the biggest, most fundamental debate in this whole topic. Why does poverty even exist in wealthy societies? Why does it stick around? Is it because of individual failures? Or is it a failure of the system itself?
And really, there are two major camps in this debate. On one side, you have what's often called the blame the victim approach. This idea suggests that poverty comes down to individual shortcomings. A lack of skill, maybe some more weakness, or just low motivation. Then on the other side, you have the blame the system argument, which says the complete opposite. That poverty is created by huge structural forces, things like social class, gender, and big shifts in the economy that are just way beyond any one person's control.
So if we dig into that blame the system view a little more, it basically argues that deep social inequality isn't an accident. It's a feature of the system, not a bug. It's a system that naturally creates extremes of both wealth and poverty. This view points to massive economic shifts where good, stable jobs have been replaced by insecure, precarious work. And this has created what one sociologist famously called the precariat. It's a mashup of precarious and proletariat, and it describes this new, growing global class of people who live with constant job and income insecurity.
And this isn't just abstract theory, right? We can see real-world examples of these structural shifts all around us. Think about the decline of big manufacturing industries that wiped out entire communities' main source of stable work. Or, fast forward to today, think about the rise of the gig economy with 0-hours contracts and a lack of basic benefits. These are huge, massive changes to the structure of our economy that have a direct impact on individual lives.
And all of this brings us right back to where we started, with Jenny. What sociology really helps us do is see that the struggles of one person like Jenny aren't just her own personal trouble, they're actually a symptom of a much wider public issue, a deep, persistent feature of the way our society is actually built.
Which leaves us with one last and pretty challenging question. If these huge, large-scale systems are the main things driving poverty, what does that mean for the classic idea that anyone can escape it just by working harder? Is personal effort on its own really enough to overcome a systemic problem? That's definitely something to think about.